everyone! Welcome again to another installment of Spooky Sundays. We are picking up from where we left off last week with Chapter 4 of We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. For those of you who caught the stream, apologies for it interrupting, and I am recording this afterwards because I foolishly left on my background music while I went through the first two pages, and somebody very kindly pointed that out, and I had to skip over, so I don't think I introduced it again after that, only the chapter. So here you go, enjoy the rest of the book, and we'll finish the last third of it next Sunday. For those of you who don't follow on Twitch, I'm twitch.tv/luckydisease if you want to catch the reading streams Spooky Sundays every 2 to 4, and I do Folklore Fridays from 4 to 6. So yeah, let's just get into it. Is the music still in? I can hear it. Chapter 4. On Sunday morning, the change was one day nearer. I was resolute about not thinking my 3 magic words and would not let them into my mind. But the air of change was so strong that there was no avoiding it. Change lay over the stairs, in the kitchen, and the garden like a fog. I would not forget my magic words. Awesome. They were Melody, Gloucester, and Pegasus, but I refused to let them in my mind. The weather was uneasy on Sunday morning, and I thought that perhaps Jonas would succeed after all in running up a storm. The sun shone into the kitchen, but there were clouds moving quickly across the sky and a sharp little breeze that came in and out of the kitchen while I had my breakfast. "Wear your boots if you wander today," Constance told me. "I don't expect that Uncle Julian will sit outdoors today. It'll be far too cool for him." "Pure spring weather," Constance said, and smiled out at her garden. "I love you, Constance," I said. "I love you too, silly Mary Cat." "Is Uncle Julian better?" "I don't think so. He had his tray while you were still asleep, and I thought he seemed very tired. He said he had an extra pill during the night. I think perhaps he's getting worse." "Are you very worried about him?" "Yes, very." "Will he die?" "Do you know what he said to me this morning?" Constance turned, leaning against the sink, and looked at me with sadness. "He thought I was Aunt Dorothy, and he held my hand and said, 'It's terrible to be old. Just lie here wondering when it will happen.' He almost frightened me." "You should have let me take him to the moon," I said. Well, I gave him his hot milk, and then he remembered who I was. I thought that Uncle Julian was probably really very happy with both Constance and Aunt Dorothy to take care of him, and I told myself that long, thin things would remind me to be kinder to Uncle Julian. And this was to be a day of long, thin things, since there had already been a hair in my toothbrush, and a fragment of string was caught on the back side of my chair, and I could see a splinter broken off the back step. "Make him a little pudding," I said. "Perhaps I will." And she took out the long, thin slicing knife and set it on the sink. "Or a cup of cocoa, and dumplings with his chicken tonight." "No, my Mary Cat, run along and wear your boots." The day outside was full of changing light, and Jonas danced in and out of the shadows as he followed me. When I ran, Jonas ran, and when I stopped and stood still, he stopped and glanced at me, and then went briskly off in another direction as though we were not acquainted, and then he sat down and waited for me to run again. We were going into the long field today, which looked like the ocean, and although I had never seen an ocean, the grass was moving in the breeze, and the cloud shadows passed back and forth and the trees in the distance moved. Jonas disappeared into the grass, which was tall enough for me to touch with my hands while I walked, and he made small, crooked movements of his own, and for a minute the grass would bend together under the breeze, and there would be a hurrying pattern across it where Jonas was running. I started at one corner and walked diagonally across the field toward the opposite corner, and in the middle I came directly to the rock covering the spot where the doll was buried. I could always find it, although much of my buried treasure was lost forever. The rock was undisturbed, and so the doll was safe. I am walking on buried treasure, I thought, with the grass brushing against my hands around me, but the reach of the long field with the grass blowing, and the pine woods at the end. And behind me was the house, and far off to my left, hidden trees and almost out of sight, was the wire fence our father had built to keep people out. When I left the long field behind the 4 apple trees we called our orchard, and along the path towards the creek, My box of silver dollars buried under the creek was safe. Near the creek, well hidden, was one of my hiding places, which I had made carefully and used often. I had torn away 2 or 3 low bushes and smoothed the ground, and all around were more bushes and tree branches, and the entrance was covered by a branch that almost touched the ground. It was not really necessary to be so secret, since no one ever came looking for me here, but I liked to lie inside with Jonas and know that I could never be found. I used leaves and branches for a bed, and Constance had given me a blanket. The trees around and overhead were so thick that it was always dry inside, and on Sunday morning I lay there with Jonas listening to his stories. All cats told stories that started with a statement. My mother, who was the first cat, told me this, and I lay my head close to Jonas and listened. There was no change coming, I thought, only spring. I was wrong to be so frightened. The days would get warmer, and Uncle Julian would sit in the sun, and Constance would laugh while she worked in the garden, and it would always be the same. Jonas went on, and then we sang, and the leaves moved overhead, and it would always be the same. I found a nest of baby snakes near the creek and killed them all. I disliked snakes, and Constance had never asked me to. I was on my way back to the house when I found a very bad omen, one of the worst. My book nailed to a tree in the pine woods had fallen down. I decided that the nail had rusted and the book had rusted away, and the book, it was a little notebook of our father's where he used to record the names of people who owed him money, and the people who ought, he thought, to do favors for him. It was useless now as protection. I had wrapped it very thoroughly in heavy paper before nailing it to the tree, but the nail had rusted, and it had fallen, and I thought I had better destroy it, in case it was now actively bad, and bring something else to the tree, perhaps a scarf of our mother's or a glove. It really was too late, although I did not know it then. He was already on his way to the house. By the time I found the book, he had probably already left his suitcase in the post office when asking directions. All Jonas and I knew then was that we were hungry, and we ran back together to the house, and came with the breeze into the kitchen. Did you really forget your boots? Constance said. She tried to do a frown, then laughed. Silly Mary Cat. Jonas has no boots. It was a wonderful day. Well, perhaps tomorrow we'll go and gather mushrooms. Well, Jonas and I are hungry today. By then he was already walking through the village towards the Black Rock, with all of them watching him and wondering and whispering as he passed. It was the last of our slow, lovely days, although, as Uncle Julian would have pointed out, we never suspected it then. Constance and I had lunch, giggling and never knowing that all the while we were happy he was trying the locked gate, peering down the path and wandering the woods, shut out for a time by our father's fence. The rain started while we were in the kitchen, and we left the kitchen door open so that we would watch the rain slanting past the doorway and washing the garden. Constance was pleased, the way any good gardener is pleased with rain. We'll see the color out there soon, she said. We'll always be here together, won't we, Constance? Don't you ever want to leave here, Mary Cat? Where could we go? I asked her. What place would be better for us than this? Who wants us outside? The world is full of terrible people. Well, I wonder sometimes. She was serious for a minute, and then she turned and smiled at me. Don't you worry, my Mary Cat. Nothing bad will happen. That must have been about the minute he found the entrance and started up the driveway, hurrying in the rain, because I had only a minute or two left before I saw him. I might have used that minute or two for so many things. I might have warned Constance somehow, or I might have thought of a new, safer magic word, or I might have pushed the table across the kitchen doorway. As it happened, I played with my spoon and looked at Jonas, and then Constance shivered, and I said, I'll get a sweater for you. That was what brought me into the hall as he was coming up the steps. I saw him through the dining room window, and for a minute, chilled, I could not breathe. I knew the front door was locked. I thought of that first. Constance, I said softly, not moving. There's one outside. The kitchen door, quickly. I thought she had heard me, because I heard her move in the kitchen. But Uncle Julian had called that moment, and she went into him, leaving the heart of our house unguarded. I ran to the front door and leaned against it and heard his steps outside. He knocked quietly at first, and then firmly, and I leaned against the door, feeling the knocks hit at me, knowing how close he was. I knew already that he was one of the bad ones. I had seen his face briefly. He was one of the bad ones, who go around and around the house, trying to get in, looking in the windows, pulling and poking and stealing souvenirs. He knocked again and then called out, "Constance! Constance!" Well, they always knew her name. They knew her name and Uncle Julian's name, and how she wore her hair and the color of her 3 dresses she had to wear in court, and how old she was and how she talked and moved, and when they could look her close in the face to see if she was crying. "I want to talk to Constance," he said outside, the way they always did. It had been a long time since any of them came, but I had not forgotten how they made me feel. At first they were always there, waiting for Constance, just waiting to see her. "Look," they said, nudging each other and pointing. "There she is. That's the one, Constance. Doesn't look like a murderer, does she?" They would tell each other. "Listen, see if you can get a picture of her when she shows again. Let's just take some of these flowers," they said comfortably to each other. "Get a rock or something out of the garden. We can take it home to show the kids." "Constance," he said outside. "Constance," he knocked again. "I want to talk to Constance," he said. "I have something important to say to her." There had always been something important they wanted to tell Constance, whether they were pushing at the door, or yelling outside, or calling on the telephone, or writing terrible, terrible letters. Sometimes they wanted Julian Blackwood. They never asked for me. I had always been sent to bed without supper. I had not been allowed in the courtroom. No one had taken my picture. When they were looking at Constance in the courtroom, I had been lying on the cot at the orphanage, staring at the ceiling, wishing they were all dead, waiting for Constance to come and take me home. "Constance, can you hear me?" he called outside. "Please listen for just a minute." I wondered if he could hear me breathing on the inside of the door. I knew what he would do next. First, he would back away from the house, sheltering his eyes from the rain, and look up to the window upstairs, hoping to see a face looking down. Then he would start towards the side of the house, following the walk which was only supposed to be used by Constance and me. When he found the side door, which we never opened, he would knock there, calling Constance. Sometimes they went away when no one answered, either at the front door or the side. The ones who were faintly embarrassed at being here at all had wished they had not bothered to come in the first place because there was really nothing to see, and they could have saved their time or gone somewhere else. They usually hurried off when they found that they were not going to get in to see Constance. But the stubborn ones, the ones I wished would die and lie there dead on the driveway, went around and around the house, trying every door and tapping on the windows. "We got a right to see her," they used to shout. "She killed all those people, didn't she?" And they drove cars up to the steps and parked there. Most of them locked their cars carefully, making sure all the windows were shut before they came to pound at the house and call to Constance. They had picnics on the lawn and took pictures of each other standing in front of the house and let their dogs run in the garden. And they wrote their names on the walls and on the front door. "Look," he said outside, "You've got to let me in." I heard him go down the steps, and I knew he was looking up. The windows were all locked. The side of the door was locked, and I knew better than to try and look out the narrow glass panels on either side of the door. They always noticed even the slightest movement. And if I had barely touched the dining room drapes, he would have been running at the house, shouting, "There she is! There she is!" I leaned against the front door and thought about opening it and finding him dead on the driveway. He was looking up at a blank face of a house looking down, because we always kept the shades drawn on the upstairs windows. He would get no answer there, and I had to find Constance's sweater before she shivered anymore. It was safe to go upstairs, but I wanted to be back with Constance while he was waiting outside. So I ran up the stairs and snatched a sweater from the chair in Constance's room, and ran downstairs, and down the hall and into the kitchen. He was sitting at the table in my chair. I I had 3 magic words, I said, holding the sweater. Their names were Melody, Gloucester, and Pegasus, and we were safe until they were said out loud. Mary Cat, Constance said, and turned and looked at me, smiling. It's our cousin, Charles Blackwood. I knew him once, he looks like father. Well, Mary, he said. He stood up, and he was taller now that he was inside, bigger and bigger, and he came closer to me. Got a kiss for your cousin Charles? Behind him, the kitchen door was open wide. He was the first one who had ever gotten inside, and Constance had let him in. Constance stood up. She knew better than to touch me, but she said, Mary Cat, gently, and held her arms out to me. I was held tight, wound round with wire. I couldn't breathe and I had to run. I threw the sweater on the floor and went out the door and down to the creek where I always went. Jonas found me after a while, and we lay there together, protected from the rain by the trees crowding overhead, dim and rich in the kind of knowing, possessive ways trees have of pressing closer. I looked back at the trees and listened to the soft sound of the water. There was no cousin, no Charles Blackwood, no intruder inside. It was because the book had fallen from the tree. I had neglected to replace it at once, and our wall of safety had cracked. Tomorrow I would find some powerful thing and nail it to the tree. I fell asleep listening to Jonas, just as the shadows were coming down. Sometime during the night, Jonas left me to go hunting, and I woke a little when he came back, pressing against me to get warm. Jonas, I said, and he purred comfortably. When I woke up, the early morning mists were wandering lightly along the creek, curling around my face and touching me. I lay there laughing, feeling the almost imaginary brush of mist across my eyes, and looking up into the trees. Chapter 5. When I came into the kitchen, still trailing mist from the creek, Constance was arranging Uncle Julian's breakfast tray. Uncle Julian was clearly feeling well this morning, since Constance was giving him tea instead of hot milk. He must have awakened early and asked for tea. I went to her and put my arms around her, and she turned and hugged me. Good morning, my Mary Cat, she said. Good morning, my Constance. Is Uncle Julian better today? Much, much better, and the sun is going to shine after yesterday's rain. I'm going to make a chocolate mousse for your dinner, my Mary Cat. I love you, Constance, and I love you too. Now, what will you have for breakfast? Pancakes, little tiny hot ones, 2 fried eggs. Today my winged horse is coming, and I am carrying you off to the moon, and on the moon we'll eat rose petals. Some rose petals are poisonous. Not on the moon. Is it true that you can plant a leaf? Some leaves, furred leaves. You can put them in water and they grow roots, and then you plant them and they grow into a plant. The kind of a plant they were when they started, of course, not just any plant. I'm sorry about that. Good morning, Jonas. You are a furred leaf, I think. Silly Mary Cat. I like a leaf that grows into a different plant, all furry. Constance was laughing. Uncle Julian will never get his breakfast if I listen to you, she said. She took up the tray and went into Uncle Julian's room. Hot tea coming, she said. Constance, my dear, a glorious morning, I think, a splendid day to work. And to sit in the sun. Jonas sat in the sunlit doorway washing his face. I was hungry. Perhaps it would be kind to Uncle Julian today if I put a feather on the lawn at the spot where Uncle Julian's chair would go. I was not allowed to bury things in the lawn. On the moon we wore feathers in our hair and rubies in our hands, and on the moon we had golden spoons. Perhaps today is a good day to begin a new chapter. Constance? Yes, Uncle Julian. Do you think I should begin chapter 44 today? Of course. Some of the early pages need a little brushing up. A work like this is never done. Shall I brush your hair? I think I will brush it myself this morning, thank you. A man's head should be his own responsibility, after all. I have no jam. Shall I get you some? No, because I see that I have somehow eaten all my toast. I fancy a broiled liver for lunch, Constance. And you shall have it. Shall I take your tray? Yes, thank you. And I will brush my hair. Constance came back into the kitchen and set down the tray. And now for you, my merry cat, she said. And Jonas. Jonas had his breakfast long ago. Will you plant a leaf for me? One of these days. She turned in her head and listened. He's still asleep. Who is still asleep? Will I watch the leaf grow? Cousin Charles is still asleep, she said, and the day fell apart around me. I saw Jonas in the doorway and Constance by the stove, but they had no color. I couldn't breathe. I was tied around tight, and everything was cold. It was a ghost, I said. Constance laughed, and it sounded very far away. Then a ghost is sleeping in Father's bed, she said, and it ate a very hearty dinner last night, while you were gone. I dreamed that he came, fell asleep on the ground, and I dreamed that he came, but then I dreamed him away. I was held tight. When Constance will leave me, I could breathe again. We talked for a good long time last night. Go and look, I said, not breathing. Go and look, he isn't there. Silly Mary Cat. I couldn't run. I had to help Constance. I took my glass and I smashed it on the floor. Now he'll go away. Constance came to the table and sat down across from me, looking very serious. I wanted to go around the table and hug her, but she still had no color. My Mary Cat, she said slowly, Cousin Charles is here. He is our cousin. As long as his father was alive. That was Arthur Blackwood, Father's brother. Cousin Charles could not come to us or try to help us because his father would not allow him. His father, she said, and smiled a little, thought very badly of us. He refused to take care of you during the trial. Did you know that? He never let our names be mentioned in his house. Then why do you mention his name in our house? Because I am trying to explain. As soon as his father died, Cousin Charles hurried here to help us. How can he help us? We're very happy, aren't we, Constance? Very happy, Mary Cat, but please be pleasant to Cousin Charles. I could breathe a little. It was going to be all right. Cousin Charles was a ghost, but a ghost that could be driven away. He'll go away, I said. I don't suppose he plans to stay forever, Constance says. He only came for a visit after all. I would have to find something, a device to use against him. Has Uncle Julian seen him? Uncle Julian knows that he's here, but Uncle Julian was too unwell last night to leave his room. He had his dinner on a tray, only a little soup. I was glad he asked for tea this morning. Today we eat in the house. Later, after Cousin Charles is awake, and I'd better sweep up that broken glass before he comes downstairs. I watched her while she swept up the glass. Today would be a glittering day, full of tiny, sparkling things. There was no point in hurrying with my breakfast, because today I could not go out until we had eaten the house, so I lingered, drinking milk slowly and watching Jonas. Before I was finished, Uncle Julian called to Constance to come and help him with his chair, and she brought him into the kitchen and put him by the table with his papers. I really think I shall commence chapter 44, he said, patting his hands together. I shall commence, I think, with a slight exaggeration and go on from there into an outright lie. Constance, my dear. Yes, Uncle Julian. I'm going to say that my wife was beautiful. Then we were all silent for a minute, puzzled by the sound of a foot stepping upstairs. He had always been silent before. It was unpleasant, this walking overhead. Constance always stepped lightly, and Uncle Julian never walked. This footstep was heavy, even, and bad. That's Cousin Charles, Constance said, looking up. Indeed, said Uncle Julian. He carefully arranged a paper before him and took up a pencil. I am anticipating considerable pleasure from the society of my brother's son, he said. Perhaps he can fill in some detail on the behavior of his family during the trial. Although I confess I have somewhere set down notes on a possible conversation they may have had. He turned to one of his notebooks. This will delay chapter 44, I suspect. I took Jonas and I went to my corner. and Constance went into the hall to meet Cousin Charles when he came down the stairs. "Good morning, Cousin Charles," she said. "Good morning, Connie." It was the same voice he used last night. I got further into my corner as she brought him into the kitchen. Uncle Julian touched his papers and turned to face the doorway. "Uncle Julian, I am pleased to meet you at last." "Charles, you're Arthur's son, but you resemble my brother, John, who is dead." "Well, Arthur's dead too, that's why I'm here." "He died wealthy, I trust. He was the only brother with no knack for money." "As a matter of fact, Uncle Julian, my father left nothing." "Ah, pity. His father left a considerable sum. It came to a considerable sum, even divided among the three of us. I always knew my share would melt away, but I had not suspected it of my brother Arthur. Perhaps your mother was an extravagant woman? I do not remember her very clearly. I recall that my niece Constance wrote to her uncle during the trial, and it was his wife who answered, requesting that the family connection be severed. I wanted to come before, Uncle Julian. I dare say. Youth is always curious, and a woman of such notoriety as your cousin Constance would present a romantic figure to a young man. Constance?" "Yes, Uncle Julian." "Have I had my breakfast?" "Yes." "Well, I will have another cup of tea then. This young man and I have a great deal to discuss." I still could not see him clearly. Perhaps he was a ghost. Perhaps because he was so very big. His great round face, looking so much like our father's, turned from Constance to Uncle Julian and back, smiling and opening its mouth to talk. I moved as far into my corner as I could. Finally, the big face turned at me. "Why, there's Mary," he said. "Good morning, Mary." I put my face down on Jonas. "Shy?" he asked Constance. "Never mind, kids always take to me." And Constance laughed. "We don't see many strangers," she said. She was not at all awkward or uncomfortable. It was as though she had been expecting all her life that Cousin Charles would come, and as though she had planned exactly what to do and to say, and almost as though in the house of her life there had always been a room kept for Cousin Charles. He stood up and he came closer to me. "That's a handsome cat," he said. "Does it have a name?" Jonas and I looked at him, and then I thought that Jonas's name might be the safest thing to speak to him first. "Jonas," I said. "Jonas, is he your special pet?" "Yes," I said. And we looked at him, Jonas and I, not daring to blink or turn away. The big white face was close, still looking like our father, and the big mouth was smiling. "We're going to be good friends, you and Jonas and I," he said. "What will you have for breakfast?" Constance asked him, and she smiled at me because I had told him Jonas's name. "Whatever you're serving," he said, and he turned away from me at last. Mary Cat had pancakes. Ah, pancakes would be great. A good breakfast in charming company on a beautiful day. What more could I ask? "Pancakes," observed Uncle Julian, "are an honored dish in this family, although I rarely take them myself. My health permits only the lightest and daintiest foods. Pancakes were served on the breakfast on the last—" "Uncle Julian," Constance said, "your papers are spilling on the floor." "Oh, let me get them then." Cousin Charles kneeled to gather the papers, and Constance said, "After breakfast you'll see my garden." "A chivalrous young man," Uncle Julian said, accepting the papers from Charles. "I thank you. I am not able myself to leap across a room and kneel on the floor, and I am gratified to find someone who can. I believe that you are a year or so older than my niece?" "I'm 32, Charles said. "And Constance is approximately 28. We long ago gave up the practice of birthdays, but 28 should be about right. Constance, I should not be talking so on an empty stomach. Where's my breakfast?" "Finished it an hour ago, Uncle Julian. I'm making you a cup of tea and pancakes for Charles." "Charles is intrepid. Your cooking, although it is of a very high standard indeed, certainly has disadvantages." "I'm not afraid to eat anything Constance cooks," Charles said. "Really?" said Uncle Julian. "I congratulate you. I was referring to the effect of a weighty meal like pancakes is apt to have on a delicate stomach. I suppose your reference was to arsenic." "Come and have your breakfast," Constance said. I was laughing, although Jonas hid my face. It took Charles a good half-minute to pick up his fork, and he kept smiling at Constance. Finally, knowing that Constance and Uncle Julian and Jonas and I were watching him, he cut off a small piece of pancake and brought it to his mouth, but he could not bring himself to put it inside. Finally, he set the fork with the piece of pancake down on his plate and turned to Uncle Julian. "You know, I was thinking," he said, "maybe while I'm here there are things I could do for you. Dig in the garden, maybe, or run errands. I'm pretty good at hard work." "You had dinner here last night and I woke up alive this morning," Constance said, and I was laughing, and she suddenly looked cross. "What? Oh. What?" said Charles. "Oh." He looked down at his fork and thought, as though he had forgotten it, and at last picked it up and put the piece of pancake into his mouth very quickly, chewed it and swallowed it, and looked up at Constance. "Delicious," he said, and Constance smiled. "Constance?" "Yes, Uncle Julian?" "I think I shall not after all begin chapter 44 this morning. I think I shall go back to chapter 17, where I recall that I made some slight mention of your cousin and his family, and their attitude during the trial. Charles, you are a clever young man. I am eager to hear your story." "That was all so long ago," Charles said. "You should have kept notes," said Uncle Julian. "I mean, can't it all be forgotten? There's no point in keeping these memories alive." "Forgotten?" Uncle Julian said. "Forgotten? It was a sad and horrible time, and it's not going to do Connie any good to keep talking about it." "Young man, you are speaking slightingly, I believe, of my work. A man does not take his work lightly. A man has his work to do, and he does it. Remember that, Charles. I'm just saying that I don't want to talk about Connie and that bad time. I shall be forced to invent, to fictionalize, to imagine. I refuse to discuss it any further. Constance?" "Yes, Uncle Julian?" And Constance looked very serious. "It did happen. I remember that it happened," said Uncle Julian, fingers at his mouth. Constance hesitated, and then she said, "Of course it did, Uncle Julian. My notes." Uncle Julian's voice trailed off, and he gestured at his papers. "Yes, Uncle Julian, it was real. And I was angry because Charles ought to be kind to Uncle Julian. I remembered today that today was going to be a day of sparkles and light, and I thought that I would find something bright and pretty to put near Uncle Julian's chair. Constance?" "Yes?" "May I go outside? Am I warm enough?" "I think so, Uncle Julian." And Constance was sorry too. Uncle Julian was shaking his head back and forth sadly, and he had put down his pencil. Constance went into Uncle Julian's room and brought out his shawl, which she put around his shoulders very gently. Charles was eating his pancakes bravely now and did not look up, and I wondered if he cared that he had not been kind to Uncle Julian. "Now you will go outside," Constance said, "and the sun will be warm, and the garden will be bright, and you will have broiled liver for your lunch." "Perhaps not," Uncle Julian said. "Perhaps I'd better have just an egg." Constance wheeled him gently to the door and eased his chair carefully down the step. Charles looked up from his pancakes, but when he started to rise to help her, she shook her head. "I'll put you in your special corner," she said to Uncle Julian, "where you can see every minute, and 5 times an hour I'll wave hello to you." We could hear her talking all the time she was wheeling Uncle Julian to his corner. Jonas left me and went to sit in the doorway and watch them. "Jonas," Charles said, and Jonas turned to look at him. "Cousin Mary doesn't like me," Charles said to Jonas. I disliked the way he was talking to Jonas, and I disliked the way Jonas appeared to be listening to him. "How can I make Cousin Mary like me?" Charles had said, and Jonas looked quickly at me and then back to Charles. "Here I've come to visit my 2 dear cousins, and my old uncle whom I haven't seen for years, and Cousin Mary won't even be polite to me. What do you think, Jonas?" There were sparkles in the sink where a drop of water was swelling to fall. Perhaps if I held my breath until the drop fell, Charles would go away, but I knew that was not true. Holding my breath was too easy. "Oh well," Charles said to Jonas, "Constance likes me, and I guess that's all that matters." Constance came to the doorway, waited for Jonas to move, and when he did not, stepped over him. "More pancakes?" she said. "No, thanks. I'm trying to get acquainted with my little cousin." "It won't be long before she's fond of you." Constance was looking at me. Jonas had fallen to washing himself, and I thought at last of what to say. "Today we meet in the house," I said. Uncle Julian slept all morning in the garden. Constance went often to the back bedroom windows to look down on him where he worked and stood sometimes, with the dust cloth in her hands, as though she were forgetting to come back and dust our mother's jewel box that held our mother's pearls, and her sapphire ring, and her brooch with the diamonds. I looked out the window only once, to see Uncle Julian with his eyes closed and Charles standing nearby. It was ugly to think of Charles walking among the vegetables and under the apple trees and across the lawn where Julian slept. "We'll let Father's room go this morning," Constance said, "because Charles is living there." Sometime later, she said, as though she had been thinking about it, "I wonder if it would be right for me to wear Mother's pearls. I've never worn pearls." "They've always been in the box," I said. "You'd have to take them out." "It's not likely that anyone would care," Constance said. "I would care, if you looked more beautiful." Constance laughed. "I'm silly now. Why should I want to wear pearls? They're better off in the box where they belong." Charles had closed the door of our father's room so I could not look inside, but I wondered if he had moved our father's things, or put a hat or a handkerchief or a glove on the dresser beside our father's silver brushes. I wondered if he had looked into the closet or into the drawers. Our father's room was in the front of the house, and I wondered if Charles had looked down from the windows and out over the lawn and the long driveway and onto the road, and wanted to be on that road and away home. "How long did it take Charles to get here?" I asked Constance. 4 or 5 hours, I think," she said. "He came by bus to the village, and he had to walk from there." "Then will it take him 4 or 5 hours to get home again?" "I suppose so, when he goes. But first he will have to walk back to the village, unless you take him with you on your winged horse." "I don't have a winged horse," I said. "Oh, Mary Cat," Constance says, "Charles is not a bad man." There were sparkles in the mirror, and inside our mother's jewel box, the diamonds and the pearls were shining in darkness. Constance made shadows up and down the hall when she went to the window to look on Uncle Julian, and outside the new leaves moved quickly in the sunlight. Charles had only gotten in because the magic was broken. I could reseal the protection around Constance and shut Charles out. He would leave the house. Every touch he made on the house must be erased. "Charles is a ghost," I said, and Constance sighed. I polished the doorknob to our father's room with my dusting cloth, and at least one of Charles' touches was gone. When we neatened the upstairs room, we came downstairs together, carrying our dust cloths and the broom and dustpan and mop like a pair of witches walking home. In the drawing room, we dusted the golden-legged chairs and the harp, and everything sparkled at us, and even the blue dress and the portrait of our mother. I dusted the wedding cake trim with a cloth on the end of a broom, staggering, and I looked up and pretended that the ceiling was the floor and that I was sweeping, hovering busily in space, looking down at my broom, weightless and flying up until the room swung dizzily and I was on the floor again looking up. "Charles has not yet seen this room," Constance said. "Mother was so proud of it. I ought to have showed it to him right away." "May I have some sandwiches for my lunch? I wanted to go down to the creek." "Sooner or later you're going to have to sit at the table with him, Mary Cat. Tonight at dinner, I promise." We dusted the dining room and the silver tea service and the high wooden backs of the chairs. Constance went every few minutes into the kitchen to look out the back door and check on Uncle Julian, and once I heard her call, "Watch out for the mud down there," and I knew she was talking to Cousin Charles. "Where did you let Charles sit last night at dinner?" I asked her once. "In Father's chair," she said, and then, "He has a perfect right to sit there. He's a guest, and he even looks like Father." "Will he sit there tonight?" Yes, Mary Cat. I dusted our father's chair thoroughly, although it was very small use if Charles was to sit there again tonight. I would have to clean all the silverware. We had finished neatening the house. When we had finished neatening the house, we came back to the kitchen. Charles was sitting at the kitchen table smoking his pipe and looking at Jonas, who was looking back at him. The pipe smoke was disagreeable in our kitchen, and I disliked having Jonas look at Charles. Constance went on out the back door to get Uncle Julian, and we could hear him say, "Dorothy, I was not asleep, Dorothy." "Cousin Mary doesn't like me," Charles said again to Jonas. "I wonder if Cousin Mary knows how I get even with people who don't like me." "Can I help you with that chair, Constance? Have a nice nap, Uncle?" Constance made sandwiches for Jonas and me, and we ate them in a tree. And I sat in a low fork, and Jonas sat in a small branch near me, watching for birds. "Jonas," I told him, "you are not to listen any more to Cousin Charles." And Jonas regarded me in wide-eyed astonishment that I should attempt to make decisions for him. "Jonas," I said, "he is a ghost." And Jonas closed his eyes and turned away. It was important to choose the exact device to drive Charles away. An imperfect magic, or incorrectly used, might only bring more disaster upon our house. I thought of my mother's jewels, since this was a day of sparkling things, but they might not be strong on a dull day, and Constance would be angry if I took them out of the box where they belonged, where she herself had decided against it. I thought of books, which are always strongly protective, but my father's book had fallen from the tree and let Charles in. Books, then, were perhaps powerless against Charles. I lay back against the tree trunk and thought of magic. If Charles had not gone away before 3 days, I would smash the mirrors in the hall. He sat across from me at dinner, in our father's chair, with his big white face blotting out the silver on the sideboard behind him. He watched while Constance cut up Uncle Julian's chicken and put it correctly on the plate, and he watched when Uncle Julian took the first bite and turned it over and over in his mouth. "Here's a biscuit, Uncle Julian," Constance said. "Eat the soft inside." Constance had forgotten and put dressing on my salad, but I would not have eaten it anyway with that big white face watching. Jonas, who was not allowed chicken, sat on the floor beside my chair. "Does he always eat with you?" Charles asked once, nodding his head at Uncle Julian. "When he's well enough," Constance said. "I wonder how you stand it." "I'll tell you, John," Uncle Julian said suddenly to Charles. "Investments are not what they were when Father had made his money. He was a shrewd man, but he never understood that times change." "Who's he talking to?" Charles asked Constance. "He thinks you're his brother John." Charles looked at Uncle Julian for a long minute, and then he shook his head and returned to his chicken. "That was my dead wife's chair on your left, young man," Uncle Julian said. "I well recall the last time she sat there. None of that," Charles said, and shook his finger at Uncle Julian. He had been holding his chicken in his hands to eat it, and his fingers sparked with grease. "We're not going to talk about that any more, Uncle." Constance was pleased with me because I had come to the table, and when I looked at her, she was smiling at me. She knew that I disliked eating when anyone was watching me, and she would save my plate and bring it to me later in the kitchen. She did not remember, I saw, that she had put dressing on my salad. "I noticed this morning," Charles said, taking up the platter of chicken and looking into it carefully, "that there was a broken step out back. How about I fix it for one of you these days? I might as well earn my keep." "It would be very kind of you," Constance said. "That step has been a nuisance for a long time. And I want to run into the village to get some pipe tobacco, so I can pick up anything else you need there." "But I go to the village on Tuesday," I said. "You do?" He looked at me across the table, his big white face turning directly at me. I was quiet. I remembered that walking into the village was the first step on Charles's way home. "Mary Cat, dear, I think if Charles doesn't mind, it might be a good idea. I never feel quite comfortable when you're away in the village," Constance laughed. "I'll give you a list, Charles, and the money, and you shall be the grocery boy." Keep the money in the house. Of course. Doesn't sound very wise. It's in Father's safe. Even so. I assure you, sir, said Uncle Julian, I make a point of examining the books thoroughly before committing myself. I cannot have been deceived. So I'm taking little cousin Mary's job away from her, Charles said, looking at me again. You'll have to find something else for her to do, Connie. I had made sure of what to say to him before I came to the table. The Amanita phaliotes, I said to him, holds 3 different poisons. There is ammonidin, which works slowly and is the most potent. There is phaliodin, which acts at once, and there is phalin, which dissolves red corpuscles, although it is the least potent. The first symptoms do not appear until 7 to 12 hours after eating, and in some cases, not before 24 or even 40 hours. The symptoms begin with violent stomach pains, cold, sweating, vomiting. Listen, Charles said. He put down his chicken. You stop that. Constance was laughing. Oh, Mary Cat, she said, laughing through the words. You are silly. I taught her, she told Charles. There are mushrooms by the creek and in the fields, and I made her learn the deadly ones. Oh, Mary Cat. Death occurs between 5 and 10 days after eating, I said. Don't think that's very funny, Charles said. Silly Mary Cat, Constance said. Chapter 6. The house was not secure just because Charles had gone out of it and into the village. For one thing, Constance had given him a key to the gates. There had originally been a key for each of us. Our father had a key, and our mother, and the keys were kept on a rack beside the kitchen door. When Charles started out for the village, Constance gave him a key, perhaps our father key, and a shopping list, and the money to pay for what he bought. You shouldn't keep money in the house like this, he said, holding it tight in his hands for a minute before he reached into a back pocket and took out a wallet. Women alone like you shouldn't keep the money in your house. I was watching him from my corner of the kitchen, but I would not let Jonas come to me while Charles was in the house. Are you sure you put everything down? He asked Constance. I have to make 2 trips. I waited until Charles was well along, perhaps almost to the Black Rock, and then I said, You forgot the library books. Constance looked at me for a minute. Miss Wickedness, he said, you wanted him to forget. How could he know about the library books? He doesn't belong in this house, and he has nothing to do with our books. Do you know, Constance said, looking into a pot on the stove, I think that soon we will be picking lettuce. The weather has stayed so warm. On the moon, I said and stopped. On the moon, Constance said, turning to smile at me. You will have lettuce all year round, perhaps? On the moon, we'll have everything. Lettuce and pumpkin pie and amanita phaliotes. We'll have cat-furred plants and horses dancing with their wings. And all the locks are solid and tight, and there are no ghosts. And on the moon, Uncle Julian would be well, and the sun would shine every day. And you would wear our mother's pearls and sing, and the sun would shine all the time. I wish I could go to your moon. I wonder if I should start the gingerbread now. It'll be cold if Charles is late. I'll be here to eat it, I said. But Charles said he loves gingerbread. I was making a little house at the table, out of the library books, standing one across 2 set on the edge. Old witch, I said, you have a gingerbread house. I do not, Constance said. I have a lovely house where I live with my sister Mary Cat. I laughed at her. She was worrying at the pot on the stove, and she had flour on her face. Maybe he'll never come back, I said. Well, he has to. I'm making gingerbread for him. Since Charles had taken my occupation for a Tuesday morning, I had nothing to do. I wondered about going down to the creek, but I had no reason to suppose that the creek would even be there, since I never visited it on Tuesday morning. Would the people in the village be waiting for me? glancing from the corners of their eyes to see if I was coming, nudging one another, and then turning in astonishment when they saw Charles. Perhaps the whole village would falter and slow, bewildered at the lack of Miss Mary Catherine Blackwood. I giggled, thinking of old Jim Donnell and the Harris boys peering anxiously up the road to see if I was coming. "What's funny?" Constance said, turning to see me. "I was thinking that you might make a gingerbread man, and you could name him Charles, and I would eat him." "Oh, Mary Cat, please." I could tell Constance was going to be irritable, partly because of me, partly because of the gingerbread, so I thought it wiser to run away. Since it was a free morning, I was uneasy at going out the doors. It might be a good time to search out a device to use against Charles, and I started up the stairs. The smell of baking gingerbread followed me almost halfway to the top. Charles had left his door open, not wide, but enough for me to get a hand inside. When I pushed a little, the door opened wide, and I looked in at our father's room, which now belonged to Charles. Charles had made his bed, I noticed. His mother must have taught him. The suitcase was on a chair, but it was closed. And there were things belonging to Charles on the dresser where our father's possessions had always been. I saw Charles's pipe and a handkerchief and things that Charles had touched and used dirtying our father's room. One drawer of the dresser was a little open, and I thought again of Charles picking over our father's clothes. I walked very softly across the room because I did not want Constance to hear me from downstairs, and I looked into the open drawer. I thought that Charles would not be pleased to know that I had caught him looking at our father's things, and something from his drawer might be extraordinarily powerful, since it could carry a guilt of Charles. I was not surprised to find that he had been looking at our father's jewelry. Inside the drawer was a leather box which held, I knew, a watch and chain made of gold, and cufflinks and a signet ring. I would not touch our mother's jewelry, but Constance had not said anything about our father's jewelry, and had not even come into this room to need it, so I thought I could open the box and take something out. The watch was inside, in a private box of its own, resting on a satin lining and not ticking. The watch chain curled beside it, and I could not touch the ring. The thought of a ring around my finger always made me feel tight, because the rings had no openings, no way to get out of them. But I liked the watch chain, which twisted and wound around my hand when I picked it up. I put the jewelry box carefully back inside the drawer, and closed the drawer, and went out of the room, and closed the door after me. And I took the watch chain into my room, where I curled it again into a sleeping gold heap on a pillow. I had intended to bury it, but I was sorry when I thought how long it had been since there was darkness in our father's jewel box, and I thought that it had earned a place up high, where it could sparkle in the sunlight, and I decided to nail it to the tree where the book had come down. While Constance made gingerbread in the kitchen, and Uncle Julian slept in his room, and Charles walked in and out of the village stores, I lay on my bed and I played with my golden chain. "That's my brother's gold watch chain," Uncle Julian said, leaning forward curiously. "Thought he was buried in it." Charles's hand was shaking as he held it out, and I could see it shaking against the yellow of the wall behind him. "In a tree," he said, his voice shaking too. "I found it nailed to a tree, for God's sake. What kind of a house is this?" "It's not important," Constance said. "Really, Charles, it's not important." "Not important, Connie. This thing's made of gold." "But no one wants it." "One of the links is smashed," Charles said, mourning over the chain. "I could have worn it." "What a hell way to treat a valuable thing. We could have sold it," he said to Constance. "But why?" "I certainly did think he was buried in it," Uncle Julian said. "He was never a man to give things away easily. I suppose he never knew they kept it from him." "It's worth money," Charles said, explaining carefully to Constance. "This is a gold watch chain, worth possibly a good deal of money. Sensible people don't go around nailing this kind of valuable things to the trees." "Lunch will be cold if you stand there worrying." I'll take it up and put it back in the box where it belongs, Charles said. No one but me noticed that he knew where it had been kept. Later, he said, looking at me, we'll find out how it got up that tree. Mary Cat put it there, Constance said. Please do come to lunch. How do you know about Mary? She always knows. Constance smiled at me. Silly Mary Cat. Does she indeed, Charles said, and he came slowly over to the table looking at me. He was a man very fond of this person, Uncle Julian said to himself, given to adorning himself and not overly clean. It was quiet in the kitchen. Constance was in Uncle Julian's room putting him to bed for his afternoon nap. Where would poor Cousin Mary go if her sister turned out? Charles asked Jonas, who listened quietly. What would poor Cousin Mary do if Constance and Charles didn't love her? I cannot think why it seemed to me that I might simply ask Charles to go away. Perhaps I thought that he had been asked politely once. Perhaps the idea of going away had not come into his mind and it was necessary to put it there. I decided that asking Charles to go away was the next thing to do, before he was everywhere in the house, and before he could never be eradicated. Already the house smelled of him, of his pipe and his shaving lotion, and the noise of him echoed into the rooms all day long. His pipe was sometimes on the kitchen table, and his gloves or the tobacco pouch or his constant boxes of matches were scattered through our rooms. He walked into the village each afternoon and brought back newspapers, which he left anywhere, even in the kitchen where Constance might see them. A spark from his pipe left a tiny burn on the rose brocade of a chair in the drawing room. Constance had not yet noticed it, and I thought not to tell her, because I hoped that the house, injured, would reject him by himself. Constance, I asked her on the bright morning. Charles had been in our house for 3 days then, and I thought, Constance, has he said anything yet about leaving? She was increasingly cross with me when I wanted Charles to leave. Always before, Constance had listened and smiled, and only been angry when Jonas and I had been wicked, but now she frowned at me often and thought somehow looked different to her. I've told you, she said to me. I've told you, and I won't hear any more silliness about Charles. He is our cousin, and he's been invited to visit us, and he will probably go when he is ready. He makes Uncle Julian sicker, I said. He's only trying to keep Uncle Julian from thinking about sad things all the time, and I agree with him. Uncle Julian should always be cheerful. Why should he be cheerful if he's going to die? I haven't been doing my duty, Constance says. Don't know what that means. I've been hiding here, Constance said slowly, as though she were not at all sure of the correct order of her words. She stood by the stove in the sunlight, with color in her hair and eyes, not smiling. And she said slowly, I have let Uncle Julian spend all of his time living in the past, and particularly reliving that one dreadful day. I have let you run wild. How long has it been since you combed your hair? I could not allow myself to be angry, particularly not angry with Constance, but I wished Charles dead. Constance needed guarding more than ever, and if I became angry and looked aside, she might very well be lost. I said very cautiously, On the moon? On the moon, Constance said and laughed unpleasantly. It's all been my fault, she said. I didn't realize how wrong I was, letting things go on because I wanted to hide. It wasn't fair to you or to Uncle Julian. And Charles is also mending the broken step. Uncle Julian should be in a hospital with nurses to take care of him, and you... She opened her eyes wide suddenly, as though seeing her old Mary Cat again, and she held out her arms to me. Oh, Mary Cat, she said, and laughed a little. Listen to me scolding you, how silly I am. I went to her and put my arms around her. I love you, Constance. You're a good child, Mary Cat, she said. That was when I left her and went outside to talk to Charles. I knew I would dislike talking to Charles, but it was almost too late to ask him to leave politely, and I thought that I should ask him once. Even the garden had become a strange landscape with Charles' figure in it, and I could see him standing under the apple trees, and the trees were crooked and shortened beside it. I came to the kitchen door and walked slowly towards him. I was trying to think charitably of him, since I would never be able to speak kindly until I did. But whenever the thought of his big white face grinning at me across the table or watching me whenever I moved, I wanted to beat at him until he went away. I wanted to stamp on him after he was dead, and see him lying on the grass. So I made my mind charitable towards Charles and came up to him slowly. "Cousin Charles," I said, and he turned to look at me. I thought of seeing him dead. "Cousin Charles, well, I have decided to ask you to please go away." "All right, you asked me." "Please, will you go away?" "No," he said. I could not think of anything further to say. I saw that he was wearing our father's gold watch chain, even with the crooked link, and I knew without seeing that our father's watch was in his pocket, and that tomorrow he would be wearing our father's signet ring, and I wonder if he would make Connie wear Constance make our wear that. And I wondered if he would make Constance put on our mother's pearls. "You stay away from Jonas," I said. "As a matter of fact," he said, "come about a month from now, I wonder who will still be here. You or me?" I ran back into the house and straight up to our father's room, where I hammered with a shoe at the mirror over the dresser until it cracked across. Then I went into my room and I rested my head on the windowsill and I slept. I was remembering these days to be kinder to Uncle Julian, and I was sorry because he was spending more and more time in his room, taking both his breakfast and his lunch on a tray, and only eating his dinners in the dining room, despite under the despising eye of Uncle Charles, or of Cousin Charles. "Can't you feed him or something?" Charles asked Constance. "He's got food all over himself." "I didn't mean to," he said, looking at Constance. "Ought to wear a baby bib," Charles said, laughing. While Charles sat in the kitchen in the mornings, eating hugely of ham and potatoes and fried eggs and hot biscuits and donuts and toast, Uncle Julian drowsed in his room over his hot milk, and sometimes when he called to Constance, Charles said, "Tell him you're busy, you don't have to go running every time he wets his bed, he just likes being waited on." I always had my breakfast earlier than Charles, and on those sunny mornings, and if he came down before I was finished, I would take my plate out and sit on the grass under the chestnut tree. Once I brought Uncle Julian a new leaf from the chestnut tree, and I put it on his windowsill. I stood outside in the sunlight and looked in at him, still lying in the dark room, and tried to think of ways I might be kinder to him. I thought of him lying alone, dreaming old Uncle Julian dreams, and I went into the kitchen and I said to Constance, "Will you make Uncle Julian a little soft cake for his lunch?" "She's too busy now," Charles said with his mouth full. "Your sister works like a slave." "Will you?" I asked Constance. "I'm sorry," Constance said. "I have so much to do. But Uncle Julian is going to die." "Constance is too busy," Charles said. "Run along and play." I followed Charles one afternoon when he went to the village. I stopped by the Black Rock because it was not one of my days for going into the village, and I watched Charles go down the main street. He stopped and talked a minute to Stella, who was standing in the sunlight outside her shop, and he bought a paper, and when I saw him sit down on the benches with the other men, I turned and I went back to our house. If I went into the village shopping again, Charles would be one of the men who watched me going past. Constance was working in her garden, and Uncle Julian slept in his chair in the sun. And when I sat quietly on my bench, Constance asked, not looking up at me, "Where have you been, Mary Cat?" "Wandering. Where's my cat?" "I think," Constance said, "that we are going to have to forbid your wandering. It's time you quieted down a little." "Does we mean you and Charles?" "Mary Cat." Constance turned toward me, sitting back against her feet and folding her hands before her. "Never realized until lately how wrong I was to let you and Uncle Julian hide here with me. We should have faced the world and tried to live normal lives. Uncle Julian should have been in a hospital, and all these years with good care and nurses to watch him. We should have been living like other people, and you should, She stopped and waved her hands helplessly. "You should have boyfriends," she said, finally, and then began to laugh because she sounded funny even to herself. "I have Jonas," I said, and we both laughed, and Uncle Julian woke up suddenly and laughed a thin old cackle. "You are the silliest person I ever saw," I told Constance, and I went off to look for Jonas. When I was wandering, Charles came back to our house. He brought a newspaper and a bottle of wine for his dinner, and our father's scarf, which I had used to tie shut the gate because Charles had a key. "I could have worn this scarf," he said irritably. I heard him from the vegetable garden where I had found Jonas sleeping in a tangle of young lettuce plants. "It's an expensive thing, and I like colors." "Belonged to father," Constance said. "That reminds me," Charles said. "One of these days I'd like to look over the rest of his clothes." He was quiet for a minute. I thought that he was probably also sitting down on my bench, and then he went on very lightly. "Also," he said, "while I'm here, I ought to go over your father's papers. There might be something important." "Not my papers," Uncle Julian said. "That young man is not to put a finger on my papers." "I haven't even seen your father's study," Charles said. "You don't use it. Nothing in there is ever touched." "Except the safe, of course," Charles said. "Constance?" "Yes, Uncle Julian." "I want you to have my papers afterwards. No one else is to touch my papers. You hear me?" "Yes, Uncle Julian." I was not allowed to open the safe where Constance kept our father's money. I was allowed to go into the study, but I disliked it, and I never even touched the doorknob. I hoped that Constance would not open the study for Charles. He already had our father's bedroom after all, and our father's watch and his gold chain and his signet ring. And I was thinking that being a demon and a ghost must be very difficult, even for Charles. If he ever forgot, or let his disguise drop for a minute, he could be recognized at once and driven away. He must be extremely careful to use the same voice every time, and present the same face in the same manner without a slip. He must be constantly on guard against betraying himself. I wondered if he would turn back to his true form when he was dead. When it grew cooler and I knew that Constance would be taking Uncle Julian indoors, I left Jonas asleep on the lettuce plants, and I came back into the house. When I came into the kitchen, Uncle Julian was poking furiously at the papers on his table, trying to get them into a small heap, and Constance was peeling potatoes. I could hear Charles moving upstairs, and for a minute the kitchen was warm and glowing as bright. "Jonas is asleep in the lettuce," I said. There is nothing I like more than cat fur in my salad," Constance said amiably. "It is time that I had a box," Uncle Julian announced. He sat back and he looked angrily at his papers. "They all must be put into a box this very minute. Constance?" "Yes, Uncle Julian, I can find you a box." "If I put all my papers in a box, and I put the box in my room, then that dreadful young man cannot touch them. He is a dreadful young man, Constance." "Really, Uncle Julian, Charles is very kind. He's dishonest." "His father was dishonest. Both my brothers were dishonest. If he tries to take my papers, you must stop him. I cannot permit tampering with my papers. I will not tolerate intrusion. You must tell him this, Constance. He is a bastard." "Uncle Julian," in a purely metaphorical sense, I assure you, both of my brothers married women of strong will. It's merely a word used among men, my dear. I apologize for submitting to you such a word to categorize an undesirable fellow. Constance turned without speaking and opened the door which led to the cellar stairs and to the rows and rows of food preserved at the very bottom of our house. She went quietly down the stairs, and we could hear Charles moving upstairs and Constance moving downstairs. "William of Orange was a bastard," Uncle Julian said to himself, and he took up a bit of paper and made a note. Constance came back up the stairs with a box which she brought to Uncle Julian. "Here's a clean box," she said. "What for?" Uncle Julian asked. To put your papers in." "That young man is to not touch my papers, Constance. I will not have that young man going through my papers." "This is all my fault," Constance said, turning to me. "He should be in a hospital." "I'll put my papers in that box, Constance, my dear, if you'll be kind enough to hand it to me." She has a happy time, I said to Constance. I should have done everything differently. It would certainly not be kind to put Uncle Julian in a hospital. But I'll have to if I... And Constance stopped suddenly, turning back to the sink and to the potatoes. Shall I put walnuts in the applesauce? I sat very quiet, listening to what she had almost said. Time was running shorter, tightening around our house, crushing me. I thought that it might be time to smash the big mirror in the hall, but then Charles's feet were coming heavily down the stairs, and through the hall and into the kitchen. Well, well, everyone's here, he said. What's for dinner? That evening, Constance played for us in the drawing room, the tall curve of her harp making shadows against our mother's portrait, and the soft notes falling into the air like petals. She played Over the Sea to Sky, and Flow Gently, Sweet Afton, and I Saw a Lady, and all the other songs our mother used to play. But I never remembered that our mother's fingers touched the strings so lightly, with such a breath of melody. Uncle Julian kept himself awake, listening and dreaming, and even Charles did not quite dare to put his feet on the furniture in the drawing room, although the smoke of his pipe drifted against the wedding cake ceiling, and he moved restlessly while Constance played. A delicate touch, Uncle Julian said once. All the Blackwood women had a very gifted touch. Charles stopped by the fireplace to knock his pipe against the granite. Pretty, he said, taking down one of the Dresden figurines. Constance stopped playing and he turned to look at her. Valuable? Not particularly, Constance said. My mother just liked them. Uncle Julian said, My particular favorite was always Bluebells of Scotland. Constance, my dear, would you... No more now, Charles said. Now Constance and I want to talk, Uncle. We've got plans to make. Chapter 7. Thursday was my most powerful day. It was the right day to settle with Charles. In the morning, Constance decided to make us spice cookies for dinner. And that was too bad, because if any of us had known that we could have told her not to bother, that Tuesday was going to be the last day. Even Uncle Julian did not suspect, however. He felt stronger on a Thursday morning, and late in the evening, Constance brought him into the kitchen, which smelled richly of spice cookies, and he continued putting his papers in the box. Charles had taken a hammer and found nails in a board and was pounding away mercilessly at the broken step. From the kitchen window, I could see that he was doing it very badly, and I was pleased. I wished the hammer to pound his thumb. I stayed into the kitchen until I was certain that they would all be there I stayed into the kitchen where I was certain that they would all keep where they were for a while, and then I went upstairs into our father's room, walking softly so Constance would not know I was there. The first thing to do was to stop our father's watch, which Charles had started. I knew he was not wearing it to mend the broken step, and he was not wearing the chain. When I found the watch and the chain and our father's signet ring on our father's dresser with Charles's tobacco pouch and 4 books of matches. I was not allowed to touch matches, but in any case, I would not have touched Charles' matches. I took up the watch and listened to it ticking, because Charles had started it. I could not turn it all the way back to where it had formerly been, because he had kept it going for 2 or 3 days. But I twisted the winding knob backward until there was a small complaining crack from the watch and the ticking stopped. When I was sure that he could never start it ticking again, I put it back gently where I had found it. One thing, at least, had been released from Charles's spell, and I thought that I had broken through his tight skin of invulnerability. I need not bother about the chain, which was broken, and I disliked the ring. Eliminating Charles from everything he had touched was almost impossible, but it seemed to me that if I altered our father's room, perhaps later the kitchen and the drawing room and the study, and even finally the garden, Charles would be lost, shut off from what he recognized. I would have to concede this was not the house he had come to visit, so he would go away. I altered our father's room very quickly and almost without noise. During the night, I had gone out into the darkness and brought in a very large basket filled with pieces of wood and broken sticks, and leaves and scraps of glass and metal from the field and the wood. Jonas came back and forth with me. amused at our walking silently while everyone slept. When I altered our father's room, I took the books from the desk and the blankets from the bed, and I put the glass and metal and the wood and the sticks and the leaves into the empty places. I could not put the things which had been our father's into my own room, so I carried them softly up the stairs to the attic, where everything else of theirs was kept. I poured a pitcher of water onto our father's bed. Charles could not sleep there again. The mirror over the dresser was already smashed, so it could not reflect Charles. He was not able to find books or clothes, and would be lost in a room of leaves and broken sticks. I tore down the curtains and I threw them on the floor. Now Charles would have to look outside and see the driveway going away and the road beyond. I looked at the room with pleasure. A demon ghost would not easily find himself here. I was back in my own room, lying on the bed and playing with Jonas when I heard Charles down below in the garden shouting to Constance. "This is too much," he was saying. "Simply too much." "What now?" Constance asked. She came into the kitchen door and I could hear Uncle Julian somewhere below saying, "Tell that young fool to stop his bellowing." I looked out quickly. The broken step had clearly been too much for Charles because the hammer and the board lay on the ground and the step was still broken. Charles was coming up the path from the creek. He was carrying something, and I wondered what he had found. "Did you ever hear anything like this?" he was saying, and even though he was close, he was still shouting. "Look at this, Connie, just look at this." "I suppose it belongs to Mary Cat," Constance says. "It does not belong to Mary Cat or anything like it. This is money." "I remember," Constance said, "silver dollars. I remember when she buried them. There must be $20 or $30 here. This is outrageous." "She likes to bury things." Charles was still shouting, shaking my box of silver dollars back and forth violently. I wondered if he would drop it. I would like to have seen Charles on the ground, scrabbling after the silver dollars. "It's not her money," he was shouting. "She has no right to hide it." I wondered how he had happened to find the box where I had buried it. Perhaps Charles and money found each other no matter how far apart they were. Perhaps Charles was engaged in systematically digging up every inch of our land. "This is terrible," he was shouting. "Terrible! She has no right." "No harm is done," Constance said, and I could see that she was puzzled, and somewhere inside the kitchen Uncle Julian was pounding and calling her. "How do you know there isn't more?" Charles held the box out accusingly. "How do you know that crazy kid hasn't buried thousands of dollars all over the yard, where we'll never find it?" "She likes to bury things. Coming, Uncle Julian." Charles followed her inside, still holding the box tenderly. I supposed I could bury the box again after he had gone, but I was not pleased. I came to the top of the stairs and watched Charles proceeding down the hall to the study. He was clearly going to put my silver dollars into Father's safe. I ran down the stairs quickly and quietly and out through the kitchen. "Silly Mary Cat," Constance said to me. She was putting the spice cookies in long rows to cool. I was thinking of Charles. I could turn him into a fly and drop him into a spider's web, watch him tangled and helpless and struggling, shut into the body of a dying, buzzing fly. I could wish him dead until he died. I could fasten him to a tree and keep him there until he grew into a trunk and bark grew out of his mouth. I could bury him in the hole where my box of silver dollars had been so safe until he came, and if he was under the ground I could walk over him, stamping my feet. He had not even bothered to fill the hole. I could imagine him walking there, noticing the spot where the ground was disturbed, stopping to poke it, and digging wildly with both his hands, scowling and finally greedy and shocked and gasping when he found my box of silver dollars. "Don't blame me," I said to the hole. I would have to find something else to bury here, and I wished it could be Charles. The hole would hold his head nicely. I laughed when I found a round stone the right size, and I scratched a face on it and buried it in the hole. "Goodbye, Charles. Next time don't stay around taking other people's things." I stayed by the creek for an hour or so. I was staying by the creek when Charles finally went upstairs and into the room which was no longer his and no longer our father's. I I thought for a minute that Charles had been in my shelter, but nothing was disturbed, as it would have been if Charles had come scratching around. He had been near enough to bother me, however, so I cleared out the grass and the leaves I usually slept on, and I shook out my blanket and put in everything fresh. I washed the flat rock where I sometimes ate meals, and I put a better branch across the entrance. I wondered if Charles would come back looking for more silver dollars, and I wondered if he would like my 6 blue marbles. I was finally hungry and went back to our house, and there in the kitchen was Charles shouting. "I can't believe it," he said, quite shrill by now. "I simply can't believe it." I wondered how long Charles was going to go on shouting. He made a black noise in our house, and his voice was getting thinner and higher. Perhaps if he shouted long enough, he would squeak. I sat on the kitchen step next to Jonas, and thought that perhaps Constance might laugh out loud if Charles squeaked at her. It never happened, however, because as soon as he saw that I was sitting on the step, he was quiet for a minute, and then when he spoke, he had brought his voice down and made it slow. "So you're back," he said. He did not move toward me, but I felt his voice as though he were coming closer. I did not look at him. I looked at Jonas, who was looking at him. "I haven't quite decided what I'm going to do with you," he said, "but whatever I do, you will remember it." "Don't bully her, Charles," Constance said. Did not like her voice either, because it was strange, and I knew she was uncertain. "It's all my fault anyway." That was her new way of thinking. I thought I would help Constance, perhaps make her laugh. "Amanita pantherina," I said, "highly poisonous. Amanita rubenscens, edible and good. Cicuta maculata is the water of the hemlock, one of the most poisonous of wild plants if taken internally. The Apocyninum cannabinium is not a poisonous plant of the first importance, but the snakeberry—" "Stop it," Charles said, still quiet. "Constance," I said, "we came home for lunch, Jonas and I." "First, you will have to explain to Cousin Charles," Constance said, and I was chilled. Charles was sitting at the kitchen table, with his chair pushed back, and turned a little to face me in the doorway. Constance stood beside him, leaning against the sink. Uncle Julian sat at his table, stirring papers. There were rows and rows of spice cookies, and the kitchen smelled of cinnamon and nutmeg. And I wondered if Constance would give Jonas a spice cookie with his supper, but of course she never did that, because this was the last day. "Now listen," Charles said. He had brought down a handful of sticks and dirt, perhaps to prove to Constance that they had really been in his room, or perhaps because he was going to clean it away handful by handful. The sticks and dirt looked wrong on the kitchen table, and I thought perhaps one reason Constance looked so sad was the dirt on her clean table. "Now listen," Charles said. "I cannot work in here if that young man is going to talk all the time," Will Julian said. "Constance, tell him he must be quiet for a while." "You too," Charles said in that soft voice. "I have put up with enough from both of you. One of you fools, one of you fouls my room and goes around burying money, and the other can't even remember my name." "Charles," I said to Jonas, "I was the one who buried the money, certainly, so I was not the one who could not remember his name. Poor Uncle Julian could not bury anything, and could not remember Charles's name. I would remember to be kinder to Uncle Julian." "Will you give Uncle Julian a spice cookie for his dinner?" I asked Constance, "and Jonas one too." "Mary Catherine," Charles said, "I am going to give you one chance to explain. Why did you make that mess in my room?" There was no reason to answer him. He was not Constance, and anything I said to him might perhaps help him get back his thin grasp on our house. I sat on the doorstep, and I played with Jonas's ears, which flicked and snapped when I tickled them. "Answer me," Charles said. How often must I tell you, John, that I know nothing whatsoever about it? Uncle Julian slammed his hand down on his papers and scattered after them. It is a quarrel between the women, and none of my affair. Do not involve myself in my wife's petty squabbles, and I strongly advise you to do the same. It's not fitting for men of dignity to threaten and reproach, because women have had a falling out. You lose stature, John. You lose stature. Shut up, Charles said, and he was shouting again, and I was pleased. Constance, he said, lowering his voice a little, this is terrible. The sooner you're out of it, the better. I will not be told to shut up by my own brother. We will leave your house, John, if that's what you really desire. I ask you, however, to reflect. My wife and I... It's all my fault, all of it, Constance said, and I thought she was going to cry. It was unthinkable for Constance to cry again after all these years. But I was held tight, I was chilled, and I could not move over to her. You are evil, I said to Charles. You are a ghost and a demon. What the hell? Charles said. Don't pay any attention, Constance told him. Don't listen to my Mary Cat's nonsense. You are a selfish man, John, perhaps even a scoundrel, and overly fond of the world's goods. I sometimes wonder, John, if you are every bit the gentleman. It's a crazy house, Charles said with conviction. Constance, this is a crazy house. I'll clean your room right away. Charles, please don't be angry. And Constance looked at me wildly, but I was held tight and I could not see her. Uncle Julian. Charles got up and looked over to where Uncle Julian sat at his table. Don't you touch my papers, Uncle Julian said, trying to cover them with his hands. You get away from my papers, you bastard! What? Charles said. I apologize, Uncle Julian said to Constance. Not language fitting for your ears, my dear. Just tell this young bastard to stay away from my papers. Look, Charles said to Uncle Julian, I tell you I've had enough of this. I'm not going to touch your silly papers, and I'm not your brother John. Of course you're not my brother John. You're not as tall enough by half an inch. You are a young bastard, and I desire that you return to your father, who, to my shame, is also my brother Arthur, and tell him I said so. In the presence of your mother, if you choose. She's a strong-willed woman, but she lacks the family feeling. She desired that the family connection be severed, and I have consequently no objection to your repeating my high language in her presence. That has all been forgotten, Uncle Julian. Constance and I... Well, I think you have forgotten yourself, young man, to take such a tone with me. I am pleased that you are repentant, but now you have taken far too much of my time. Please, be extremely quiet now. Not until I have finished with your niece, Mary Catherine. My niece, Mary Catherine, has been a long time dead. Young man, she did not survive the loss of her family. Suppose you knew that. What? Charles turned furiously to Constance. My niece, Mary Catherine, died in an orphanage of neglect during her sister's trial for murder. But she is of very little consequence to my book, so we will have done with her. She's sitting right here, Charles waved his hands. His face was red. Young man, Uncle Julian put down his pencil and half turned to Charles. I have pointed out to you the importance of my work. You choose constantly to interrupt me. I have had enough. You must either be quiet or you must leave this room. I was laughing at Charles, and even Constance was smiling. Charles stood staring at Uncle Julian, and Uncle Julian, through his papers, said to himself, Damned impertinent puppy. And then, Constance. Yes, Uncle Julian. Why have my papers been put into this box? I shall have to take them all out again and rearrange them. Has that young man been near my papers, has he? No, Uncle Julian. He takes a great deal upon himself, I think. When is he going away? Not going away, Charles said. I am going to stay. Impossible, Uncle Julian said. We have not the room. Constance. Yes, Uncle Julian. I would like a chop for my lunch. A nice little chop, neatly broiled. Perhaps a mushroom. Yes, Constance said with relief. I should start lunch. and as though she were happy to be doing it at last, she came to the table to brush away the dirt and the leaves that Charles had left there. She brushed them into a paper bag, and she threw the bag into the wastebasket, and then she came back with a cloth and scrubbed the table. Charles looked at her and at me and Uncle Julian. He was clearly baffled, unable to grasp his fingers tightly around anything he saw or heard, and it was a joyful sight to see the first twistings and turnings of the demon caught, and I was very proud of Uncle Julian. Constance smiled down at Charles, happy that no one was shouting anymore. She was going to cry now, and perhaps she too was getting a quick glimpse of the straining demon because she said, "You look tired, Charles. Go and rest until lunch." "Go and rest where?" he said, still angry. "I'm not going to stir out of here until something is done about that girl." "Mary Cat, why should anything be done? I said I would clean your room." "Aren't you even going to punish her?" "Punish me?" And I was standing then, shivering against the door frame. "Punish me? You mean send me to bed without my dinner?" And I ran until I was in the field of grass, in the very center where it was safe. And I sat there, the grass taller than my head and hiding me. And Jonas found me, and we sat there together where no one could ever see us. After a very long time, I stood up again, because I knew where I had to be going. I was going to the summer house, and I had not been in the summer house for nearly 6 years, but Charles had blackened the world, and only the summer house would do. Jonas would not follow me. He disliked the summer house, and when he saw me turning to the overgrown path which led there, he went another way as if he had something important to do, and would meet me somewhere later. No one had ever liked the summer house very much, I remembered. Our father had planned it and had intended to leave the creek near it and bring a tiny waterfall, but something had gotten into the wood and the stone and the paint when the summer house was built and made it bad. Our mother had once seen a rat in the doorway looking in, and nothing after that could persuade her to go in there again. And where our mother did not go, no one else went. I had never buried anything around here. The ground was black and wet, and nothing buried would have been quite comfortable. The trees pressed too closely against the sides of the summer house, and breathed heavily on its roof, and the poor flowers planted here once had either died or grown into huge tasteless wild things. When I stood near the summer house and I looked at it, I thought it the ugliest place I had ever seen. I remembered that our mother had quite seriously asked to have it burned down. Inside was all wet and dark, and I disliked sitting on the stone floor, but there was no other place. Once I recalled there had been chairs here, and perhaps even a low table. These were gone now, carried off or rotted away. I sat on the floor and placed all of them correctly in my mind, in the circle around the dining room table. Our father sat at the head, and our mother sat at the foot, and Uncle Julian sat on one hand of our mother, and our brother Thomas on the other. And beside my father sat our Aunt Dorothy and Constance. And I sat between Constance and Uncle Julian, in my rightful, my own, and my proper place at the table. Slowly, I began to listen to them talking. To buy a book for Mary Catherine. Lucy, should not dear Mary Catherine have a new book? Mary Catherine should ought to have anything she wants, my dear. Our most loved daughter shall have anything she likes. Constance, your sister lacks butter. Pass it to her at once, please. Mary Catherine, we all love you. You must never be punished. Lucy, you are to see that our most loved daughter, Mary Catherine, is never punished. Mary Catherine would never allow herself to do anything wrong. There's never a need to punish her. I have heard, Lucy, of disobedient children being sent to their beds without dinner as punishment. That must not ever be permitted with our Mary Catherine. Well, I quite agree, my dear. Mary Catherine must never be punished, must never be sent to bed without her dinner. Mary Catherine will never allow herself to do anything inviting punishment. Our beloved, our dearest Mary Catherine must be guarded and cherished. Thomas, give your sister her dinner. Or give your sister your dinner. She would like more to eat. Dorothy, Julian, rise when our beloved daughter rises. Bow all your heads to our adored Mary Catherine. Alright, so we're gonna stop today at chapter 8, which is the beginning. We'll resume again next Sunday, which probably will finish this, actually. Yeah, for sure. Definitely be able to get through the rest of it by next Sunday. And Friday again, we'll be continuing with the Norse mythology on volume 2 of the Children of Odin. And I thank everybody again for tuning in. I'm gonna go now because I'm really super hungry and my mouth is very dry and I'm very thirsty. But once again, thanks a lot for tuning in and I hope you really liked it. And we'll be back again on Friday with the Norse mythology. So, bye guys, thanks a lot!